Hi everyone, I am Laura Hamzich and I am Director of Digital and Communications at Brook. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today, and obviously a huge thanks to our brilliant chair and our brilliant panel for being willing to give up their time to come and share their knowledge and their experiences today. I really appreciate it. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to EBO for sponsoring the event and for their support with Brook's own AI journey. So I thought it would be helpful to set the scene a little bit about why Brook has decided to hold this event. This week is Sexual Health Week, and the theme this year is Playing It Safe. Now, we hold Sexual Health Week every year, but this session is one of 4 events happening today as part of our very first safeguarding conference. For those of you who are not familiar with Brook, we are a national charity supporting people with their sexual health and their well-being. And last year we supported 1.43 million people. Now, we do this in a number of ways. So we deliver free and confidential sexual health and well-being services to people of all ages. And this includes providing contraception, STI testing and treatment, pregnancy testing and decision-making support, as well as well-being programmes and counselling. And another key focus of Brook's work is relationships and sex education. So our education teams work directly with young people, with teachers, parents and carers to provide education and training. And so for obvious reasons, safeguarding is a really integral part of what Brook does day in and day out, be it seeing someone in one of our clinics or in a school setting. Our incredible colleagues work tirelessly to safeguard those people through all the work that they do on a daily basis. And that safeguarding has been integral for the 6 decades that the charity has existed. So it's fair to say that safeguarding is an area where Brook feels really confident and very experienced. So we have 4 events on today, and Brook is using some of those to confidently share this specialist knowledge and expertise. And for some of the events, we're hosting the events because we want to strengthen our practice and approaches, this being one of them. So this morning, for example, we had a session launching a new and improved tool designed to support professionals to spot the signs of child sexual exploitation. And this afternoon, after this session, we have an event looking at the role relationships and sex education plays in safeguarding young people. Now, for the other 2 events, this one included, we're looking to you and to the sector for some support and some guidance in our own approaches in areas that perhaps feel like newer territory and perhaps where we feel a bit less confident. So across lunchtime today, we had a really brilliant session looking at safeguarding young people in a mental health crisis. And that was because a significant focus of Brook's safeguarding efforts right now are focused on young people in crisis who are suicidal or self-harming. And while we're really confident when it comes to safeguarding young people when we're talking about their sexual health and their relationships, suicide and self-harm feels like quite a new frontier and a more pressing problem, especially given the strain on mental health services. So the idea was to hold an event to bring people together, sector colleagues and experts to share learning. So in a similar vein, this event that you're attending has been initiated because me and my team are looking closely at the possibilities of AI, and we're thinking about how we can improve the services that we provide to people while still ensuring that our safeguarding approach is woven into any application of it. Now, we're very early in our journey, and it's fair to say that we're still at the point of feeling quite courageous and quite ambitious about what we want to do. We're in the process of seeking funding for our projects. But despite that enthusiasm, we are absolutely clear that we have to have a laser focus on how we safeguard the people that we want to support using AI. And we also need to take our safeguarding and our clinical colleagues along with us on the journey and make sure that they're also absolutely comfortable with our approach. So today is not about me sharing my AI wisdom. It's more me holding up my hands and saying, I'm really excited about the possibilities, but I'm really cognizant of the risks and I don't have all the answers yet. But as a sector, I think lots of us are in the same boat. And I think it's important that we think about how we can best share our learning and our insights, and we learn together, because this is really fast moving and it's rapidly evolving, and we've got to get it right, both for the organisations that we work for, but also the people that we support. I'm not going to talk about what we're doing with AI at Brook just yet. We'll come on to that later on. But for now, I'd love to hand over to Zoe Amma, who I'm sure you're all familiar with. And in fact, I imagine lots of you are here precisely because you know and respect Zoe. For anyone who doesn't know Zoe, she is one of the charity sector's leading digital experts and author of the annual Charity Digital Skills Report, which is a really invaluable temperature check of what's happening with digital in the sector. And in fact, the most recent 2023 report shone a really interesting light on how everyone's feeling about AI. Zoe's not only a huge support and champion of the sector, but she's also extremely knowledgeable. So I know that Zoe will guide us through this with her usual aplomb. So Zoe, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Laura, for that very kind introduction. And I'm honestly truly honoured to be here today with three amazing women to be talking about AI, which, as Laura says, is a topic where we're all finding our way. We're all working out what to do. We're all learning together. And that's very much what today is about. None of us have all the answers, but coming together. And thank you, Brook, for bringing us together to do that. I hope will provide all of us with a bit of a way forward. And we're looking forward to hearing from our panelists as much as our delegates about where you're at, what challenges you're finding. So we've got time for Q&A later on in this session. So we're going to run through today till 4:15. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists in a few minutes. But firstly, speaking of temperature checks, we thought it might be nice to get a sense of where everyone is at with AI with their organisations, and there's no right or wrong answers here. So what we're going to do for you in a second is we're going to pop up a poll. We're going to find out a bit more about where you're at with these tools and with AI, and then we'll have a look at the findings all together and see how they compare to some of those sector trends about AI. Thank you, Sam, for the poll. So please do take a look and respond when you're ready, and then I think by the magic of Zoom we will see the results as they begin to come in, and we'll talk those through. So very exciting. Are you and your charity currently using AI in day-to-day operations? So just over half of you said no, which is really interesting, and we'll compare that to what the Charity Digital Skills Report says in a moment. And to what extent do you think that AI will transform your organisation's work? So almost half of you, 44%, are saying you're not sure, which is absolutely fair enough. There's so many different things to play for at the moment. And just over a third of you are saying a lot. So that's 36%, which is really interesting. And I'm just looking here at how this compares with the results of the Charity Digital Skills Report. So this year, in the survey that we just launched over the summer, more than a third, just over a third, said that they were already using AI for certain tasks. So actually maybe definitely more than in the poll. So that's quite interesting. And then to what extent do you think AI will transform your organisation's work? What we saw in the poll over the summer was that 78% thought that AI would be really transformative to their organisation. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. I think you're always going to get a slightly different number based on who's in the room. And it'll be interesting to think about what different people in all of our different organisations might say if they were asked this question, and whether different teams would say different things. So always interesting to see where people are at with this. Great, so we're all learning together. That's what today is all about. So with that food for thought in mind about where we're all at with AI, I'm very excited to be joined by these wonderful panelists. You've already met Laura from Brook. I don't know whether you've met Penny yet, who's Penny Nkrumah. She's Innovation and Product Manager at New Philanthropy Capital, doing some really interesting work over there on AI. And we're going to hear about all of this shortly. And then Louise Corden, who's Senior Product Manager at Citizens Advice. So three amazing people with three very different experiences of AI, but I think we're all going to throw those stories into the mix today and hear about where we're all at with it and where our different organisations are coming at from in this new area of emerging tech. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to tell us what they're working on in AI in their organisation, what kind of activities they're undertaking, and a bit more of the story so far of where they are at with AI. So I'm going to go in the order that people are on my screen. So Louise, let's start with you.
Thank you, Zoe, and wonderful to be here. So hello, I'm Louise, my pronouns are she and her. As Zoe mentioned, I am currently at Citizens Advice, but I've been invited here today with some of my experience in previous roles, including at the NSPCC, has some relevance in that when I was at the NSPCC, I designed and led the creation of a chatbot that lives on Childline. So shall I just give a few details about what we're looking at Citizens Advice at the moment in terms of kind of AI? We are considering it from a number of different perspectives, and I suppose the reason that we're starting to look at it is that it can provide lots of efficiencies. So we have identified that, well, in ours as in lots of places, I'm sure there's been quite a lot of hype around particularly new tools like ChatGPT. So we have made an assessment that those are not necessarily quite right for some of our client-facing use cases at the moment, but we are considering it for some internal use cases, and I can go into a bit more detail about that. So the reason we've chosen not to use it sort of externally is that ChatGPT, and some of you who might have had a play around with this already, and I'm conscious there's a lot of jargon in this space, which I know we'll try and demystify through this session as well. But for those of you who've tried ChatGPT, you can type in a question in your normal way you would phrase it, and it can return an answer that sounds very fluid and confident, but crucially is not always factually accurate. So for an advice-giving charity like Citizens Advice, we want to make sure that any advice that we give is true. We provide advice on issues like housing and benefits advice, as well as immigration status. So really these kind of crucial issues across people's kind of lives and well-being. So for us, we would never want to use a tool where there was the possibility we would give inaccurate advice. So for us, we've made a decision not to use a tool like that at the moment on any of our kind of advice giving channels, but there are some places that we're considering those sorts of tools internally, including how we present summarize potential advice for our advisors, so helping them write emails and messages that they might send to other people, but those will get checked by individuals, as well as some case summarization, which I can go down into a bit more detail.
Great, thank you very much, Louise. A real variety of interesting activities and some really fascinating decisions being made. Thank you for sharing that. Penny, let's go to you.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the intro, Zoe. So as a innovation and product manager at NPC, one of the projects that I'm working on is Signpost Plus, and it is a project that's looking at how we can develop signposting infrastructure to better support young people so they're able to access and find services in their local areas when they are in need. And there are two ways that we are looking at how AI impacts this space. And when I say impact, we are working with the Mix, who, Laura, you mentioned, were in another panel today. So we are working with the Mix and supporting them to develop a chatbot. So what they found during the pandemic was that a lot of young people were accessing their helpline in a crisis. So that helpline has now become a crisis line. And for them to be able to support more young people, they're developing a chatbot that will enable them to reach more young people. So we are working with them and supporting them to develop that. In addition to that, AI, and I'm sure we'll get to this as we go through our conversation, but AI is changing the way that we access information as well. So when we are thinking about signposting and how young people are accessing services, we do need to think about how, if we're talking about infrastructure, we need to talk about how AI changes that infrastructure, because for anyone, how they might access that service. And so we are really looking at what a user journey looks like. And we have a group of young people who are supporting us with that so that we can really nail down what the user journey will be and how it will change, so that that is built into signposting infrastructure in the future. And in addition to that, I'm working on another project around volunteering and digital tools for volunteering. And again, AI, even if we aren't necessarily developing an AI, well, the Mix are developing an AI product, but if at NPC, we're thinking about how AI changes the social sector. And in a way, I guess the impact of that is how it affects social impact, and what the impact of AI will be moving forward, and how it changes the way that we interact with one another and how services are delivered in future. So there's quite a bit that we're doing in this space, but a lot of it is trying to understand. One of the things that I'm not a super technical person, but I really am interested in design. And I think AI really does impact the way that services are designed and also how digital tools are designed too. So we really are doing a lot of research on that.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Penny. There's so much more within what you said that we'll be talking more about today. And I love your point about how, these tools are really going to change how people interact with civil society and what they expect from civil society. And I think that's where, coming back to Louisa's point about decision making, is so key, isn't it? We need to make sure we're doing the right things in line with what users want and how those needs are evolving. Fantastic. Thank you. Laura, let's hear from you. Where's Brook at with AI?
We are early stages, as I said in my intro, but we're exploring AI because we want to improve knowledge of and access to contraception. So contraception is, of course, a huge part of what Brook does and has always done. And at the moment, we are observing a number of worrying trends which point to a reduced use of contraception. So I'm just going to give you a few sort of data points. But first of all, abortion rates are through the roof. So the first couple of months of 2023 saw a 134% increase compared with the same period in 2022. The under 18 conception rate is also rising for the first time in 20 years. There was a huge amount of work done around the teenage pregnancy strategy, and we're starting to see things slide back. And sexually transmitted infections, some of them are at the highest rates since records began. So we can never conclusively pin down the cause of those things to one thing alone, but we do know that thanks to spending cuts, there are problems when it comes to accessing contraception. So that's one element we want to look at. The other is that we have observed, well, we've heard through our frontline staff, and then we've observed through our social media profiles, that there is a growing resistance to the use of hormonal contraception. And we know that one of the things that is contributing to that is a number of influencers talking about things like Natural Cycles, which is an app that helps you to track your menstrual cycle and then identifies when in your cycle it's safe to have unprotected sex. And as you can imagine, there are a few pitfalls with that method. So what we want to do is we want to deploy AI in two different ways. We want to improve access and we want to tackle misinformation. So in terms of access, we'll take that one first. So Brook has what it calls a digital front door to its clinical services. And through that, users can order home STI test kits, self-managed treatment for STIs, and also can request contraception. Now, the request for contraception is in essence a really thorough questionnaire with all of the questions that we need to ask in order to create a client record, but also to assess the risk profile of that user, to assess whether it's okay for them to receive support remotely. So our goal is to evolve that into from what's essentially a form into an AI-powered conversation. So depending on the method and the risk profile of the user, we then want to be able to use that to provide self-administered methods such as the pill or the contraceptive patch through the post, or provide links to appointment booking for clinician-administered methods like the coil or the injection. So that's access. And then the second aspect is misinformation. So like all of us, we have a huge website. We've got over 200 pages of content and a variety of tools. We have a chatbot as well. And we've worked really hard to make sure that any questions that people might have are answered via that content and through those tools. What we want to try and do with AI is to take things to the next level by having all of that content ingested so that a virtual agent can provide more tailored advice on a variety of topics, including contraception, which is one of the commonest reasons people come to our site. And then it would, using, again, we'll come on to some of these terms, but using natural language processing, it would replicate a human conversation, making sure that the context was correct, but also that the conversation was delivered with something that replicates human empathy. Now, I think we're becoming increasingly conscious that many young people won't even make it to our website, let alone any website, to validate some of these choices around contraception. And so what we're really excited to test is deploying that same AI-powered virtual agent via direct messaging within our social media channels. So taking it to the source of some of this misinformation and into those spaces that young people inhabit. So that's what we're planning to do. Ambitious when you say it out loud.
Thank you, Laura. That's really both fascinating and worrying as the mum of two soon-to-be teenagers. Really interesting how you're tackling that massive challenge from those two different angles. Fantastic. So all three of you there have talked about where you're at, and we thought it'd be helpful at this point to try and unpack some of these different terms that we're all hearing around AI, because I think so many people will have different interpretations of what these terms actually mean. So Laura, I think we're going to stay with you, aren't we, first of all, to talk about some of those key concepts, and we're going to unpack, well, what is AI and what is generative AI, and Laura, I think you're going to take us through your interpretation of those terms.
Yes, and it is only that, so please feel free to chip in if anyone wants to correct or add or disagree. So what is AI? So artificial intelligence is when machines are programmed to simulate human intelligence or perform tasks that we would typically perform. So if we go back to the example I just gave, we want to use AI to tackle misinformation by ingesting website content so that the virtual agent can learn about the topics and then provide information and advice in a way that emulates a human conversation. And in the other case, we'll be using AI to simulate a conversation with a member of Brook staff to gather that information we need for a health record and then it would be passed to a human being to make the decision about whether or not someone can be prescribed a method of contraception. So that's my definition applied to how we're using it at Brook, and we are not dipping our toe in generative AI. So I think that's probably where we stay. Do we want to talk about that definition before I move on to generative, or shall I jump into that?
Yeah, go for it, Laura.
Okay, here goes. So generative AI is going a step beyond that. So the machines are not only performing the tasks that they've been programmed to perform, but they're programmed to replicate human creativity. So to some degree, they appear to be thinking for themselves and taking initiative. I imagine lots of people have played around with things like ChatGPT and Bard. If not, I'll put the links in the thank you and follow-up email to this session so you can have a look yourselves. You just go in and start playing. There's no complicated registering for them. So ChatGPT and Bard, for example, provide examples to complex questions by pulling from a variety of sources of information. So the way we might Google something and read around a subject and then form our own opinions, draw our own conclusions, and then write up our interpretation and thoughts, a bit like I've done with these definitions, generative AI will do it for you. So it's really sort of looking across patterns of data and structures of data and then pulling it together. Now, the example I gave you was quite simple because it's pulling it together to create content, but it can do that to create video and audio and so on. And again, the example I gave was simple, but when I've been reading around the subject, for instance, in medicine, it's being used to diagnose conditions, design clinical trials, and develop new drugs. In the financial sector, it's being used for enhancing fraud detection, predictive modelling, and evaluating risk. And a really interesting example is being used in gaming to assess the emotional state of the player and how well they're playing and to adjust the game accordingly. So some really broad and different examples there. And I think, as is always the case with these things, the possibilities and the potential are really only constrained by our imagination.
That's so helpful. Thank you, Laura, for unpacking that and making it, really relevant and talking about how you're using these tools at Brook, but also what those definitions mean for them. And I love your point about looking outside the sector as well. I'd really encourage everyone to do that. I was talking to someone who works in financial services recently, and obviously, as you say, that AI has become relatively mature in that sector. And many banks are getting to a point now where actually you don't necessarily need a lot of people to do some of the things that they need to do day-to-day operations. So we're seeing that link starting to break between headcount, capability, and the fact that you can still continue to scale. So that's a really interesting trend that I'm keeping an eye on. Brilliant. So we've heard about AI, we've heard about generative AI in particular. And now we're going to talk about the difference between AI and machine learning, because these two things often get talked about hand in hand, don't they? So Louise, you're going to talk us through the difference between those two things.
Yes. So machine learning is simply a type of AI. It is a type that generally needs a lot of data. So you need to be able to start with a huge amount of information in the first place. And the idea behind it is that if you gave a computer some rules, so for example, if you were trying to create a spam filter for your emails, if you gave a computer a huge number of emails marked these are spam and these are not spam, it would go away and detect what the patterns were in that and how it would find ways that it could pick out the items that are spam have these characteristics, and it would sort of teach itself then to use the data it had been presented with to be able to predict any new email that you then gave it. It would say this one seems to match the characteristics of something that look like spam. So it needs really large quantities of data. Again, it tends to be used in sort of a similar example that Laura gave around financial services and spotting fraudulent transactions. It's also what gets used for things like recommendations. So if you're shopping online, lots of those recommendations will have been powered by machine learning, and it would the algorithm is looking at all the things that someone browsed initially and then what they ended up purchasing, and it has spotted what the patterns in those are to make a prediction that you, looking for one particular item, actually might be interested in this one as well. So I would say in a charity context, it's potentially a bit less relevant for us. It's going to be not something that we as charities or people in non-profit organisations are going to be exploring probably anytime immediately. I think there are a few areas such as sort of donation data and maybe being able to predict which of your donors you should target with your marketing. I think there are a kind of few very interesting examples that charities might want to explore from there. But in general, lots of the opportunities for charities in AI come from some of these other examples. So the kind of conversational AI examples that Laura mentioned earlier is one that's going to be generally a bit more applicable to charities. And also some of these sort of other AI kind of tools. So I think it's probably worth saying as well, at this point, I think there's a lot of a perception about AI as being a new future thing that we are just embarking on. And for some of these examples of AI are things that we currently use. So on this call, all of our backgrounds are adjusted by AI to filter out any of the background behind us. Things like captions, those are generated by AI. So there are already lots of examples that you will use in your day-to-day work that are actually powered by AI, but perhaps you haven't thought about them in that way. So I think useful to consider that too.
That's really interesting, Louise. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such a great point. We're all interacting with these technologies day to day, aren't we? Even when perhaps we might not realise it. And I imagine at Citizens Advice, you're hearing lots of examples of that, maybe from some of the people that you advise.
Yeah, potentially. I think it's one of the things that we do is about scams and advising people about scams. There are lots of obviously scam examples that have are using those sorts of new channels or new technologies to take advantage of people. But I do think it's worth remembering that we're already sort of using some of this stuff, and it's not necessarily even though you might not understand how it works in a huge amount of detail. I think there's real benefit in coming along to sessions like this or trying to investigate the use of some of these tools. So the ChatGPT example that a few of us have mentioned so far, that's a tool just anyone can go along and play with, and you'll start to get a sense for what it can do and what it can't do as well. So yeah, definitely worth playing around.
Thanks, Louise. Now, Penny, what a massive question, and you were beginning to talk a bit about it earlier. So we were discussing how might AI change the charity sector, and I loved your point about the different ways in which people might begin to interact with civil society, but also information and advice as well. Can you gaze into your crystal ball for us and tell us how AI might change the charity sector?
Absolutely. As Louise just said, we are all interacting with AI already, whether we know it or not. I think that the way that AI will change the charity sector more than anything will be in the way that the charity sector behaves. And by that, what I mean is, I think the charity sector typically has kind of lagged behind other sectors in implementing digital tools within the sector as a whole. And so I think AI, more than anything, with the interest in AI, I think it will open up a lot of organizations to consider how they might change the way that they interact with the people that they're supporting by introducing either AI or any other digital tool. So not in the way that you would imagine or think about AI, in that everybody will start to develop a product, but I think it opens up the door for us to have a real conversation about digital tools. And I do think that happened during the pandemic as well. I also think that it will change the way that charities interact with the people that they're supporting, and also interact with volunteers and the people that work for them as well. And by that, introducing things like a chatbot will inevitably change the way that you communicate with the people that you're supporting. And for the reason why we're all here, I do think that safeguarding needs to be a key feature and factor in that, in how we continue to safeguard those people who are vulnerable, because a lot of the time the reason why people are going to charities is because they are in a vulnerable place and they're looking for somebody to support them and to hear them. And I think it's really important that we remember that with the introduction of AI or any other digital tool. We need to just remember who we're doing it for. I would say that when we think about efficiency, I remember when in the latest strikes, RNIB in particular were campaigning against the closure of stations. And I think we do, in thinking about how to create and make things more efficient, we do need to think about how we continually support those people who are the most vulnerable, because the closure of stations, that is about efficiency, and AI, again, it's about efficiency. How do we save time so that we have a machine to do the things that we can save time on, so that we are able to access and support more people? And I think that those are things that we need to consider when we think about AI and how AI will change the sector, because ultimately the charitable sector, I think, has always focused on social interactions and social connection, and that is going to change. And I think we just need to consider, again, how we design products that allow that feature of the charitable sector that people value so much to remain, while we are trying to create things that help us to do things differently. So I don't think it's a question of how AI helps us to do things better, but I think how does AI help us to do things differently, so that we can reach more people.
Thanks, Penny. That's fascinating, because there's two things there, isn't it? There's the how do we preserve the kind of secret source of the sector, so that AI, works with the spirit of that, incorporates the spirit of that. But at the same time, we also work out how to tap into the efficiency of these tools, whilst making sure that efficiency is given the right weighting in the decision-making criteria that we use in order to decide how we're going to deploy these tools. And if I could just ask a follow-up question, because I found what you said really fascinating there. Do you think we will get to a point when, say, someone who needs advice about housing, for example, they would go to ChatGPT rather than calling up the helpline, or even perhaps looking online at a housing charity's website?
Yes, I do think we are moving there. And I think that isn't necessarily because of the introduction of AI, but I think it's because of our public services being depleted, and a lot of these public services not having the capacity to support people in the way that they need it. So, and for people who may not necessarily have the means to pay for that advice, they would go to something like ChatGPT, which is free. In one of the projects that we have at NPC that I'm not personally working on, but one of my colleagues did share that when it comes to mental health services, we are reaching a point where the NHS aren't able to support a lot of people who are in crisis and in a place where they really need support with their mental health. And the reality is that those people want to find somewhere to go to get that support. And so ChatGPT, and I think this is the point that Laura was making about misinformation. Misinformation is spread a lot more widely when you have people who are looking for answers and can't find them, and may go to other places to get that information where they're not able to see a specialist or an expert or a GP who will be able to provide them with that information. And I think that is where we need to consider how these products are introduced and how they change the way that we interact with information in society, but also how that it impacts people who are most vulnerable and may not have people who they're able to go to get that support and that guidance and that advice that they really need.
Absolutely. It's an area, I mean, I think this area of emerging tech is absolutely one which makes safeguard even more complex, isn't it? And what you've just said really speaks to the fact it's what we will see and witness through the work that we all do in charities. But there's that aspect of safeguarding, as you spoke to, Laura, in the work that Brook are doing, which is actually the stuff that you don't see, which in some ways is even more worrying, isn't it? Because the impact it's having on the community you support. Okay, brilliant. So that's a really nice way into diving into the meat of this discussion then around safeguarding in AI. And I know this is a very complex topic. We're all at early-ish stages with it. Laura, let's turn to you then. What have you learned so far about this very thorny issue of safeguarding in AI?
Well, again, we're fairly early on in the process. I think that it's worth saying that this project is coming hot on the heels of our digital front door project that I mentioned, which has been happening over the last 2 years and has involved a huge, I suppose, culture shift in terms of how our particular clinical and frontline colleagues think about digital and how we can apply it. We did a sort of it was a digital skills survey with you, wasn't it, Zoe, back in 2021, and it really showed that our clinical teams were really nervous about digital and what we had been proposing, which is this digital front door. And so we put a huge amount of energy and effort into working very closely with those colleagues to make sure that they were guided and supported through the process, that they had lots of input in the process, that they felt ownership of it, and that we started in a couple of pilot sites and we really worked closely with them to understand how it would all work, and then implemented it with their support. And an integral part of that was how we work with our safeguarding team. And they were brilliant. They were really courageous and really determined that we could do it, and that it shouldn't be any different to how we safeguard someone face to face. Yes, there are different complexities and barriers, but they were very resolute that we could and we should, pursue these routes. So I think that we're going into this project feeling quite emboldened by that process. We are at the point of trying to seek funding, but also really drill down in the meantime into how these two applications will work. So talking in detail with EBO, who we're working with, who are kindly sponsoring this session, to understand, well, okay, so your tool will ingest all of our content, then what? Well, it will all be ingested, and then we'll filter it and we'll look at it together and we'll test. So that's helping us to understand, okay, fine. So there'll be lots and lots of checks and balances before this ever makes it to a user, and lots of opportunities for us to test it, to look at it, to look at it with our safeguarding team, to explain to them how it's working. So I think that's going to be really fundamental. And I think it's also worth saying that yes, we'll learn lots about AI in the process, but we don't have to become experts in it. It's about remaining expert in what it is your organisation does, the support that it provides, and keeping that absolutely front and centre when you're approaching any project like this. So yeah, I think that's what I would say we are doing.
That's really interesting, Laura. Thank you. And it's great that you had that support there and that guidance from your safeguarding team. What would you say perhaps to other charities where they have got a safeguarding team, but they're perhaps a bit nervous, perhaps they're not as digitally savvy? Is there any advice you'd give to charities about that?
I think that you need to start with them. Not race ahead and get too excited about your plans. I think you need to start with them, talk about what it is that you're aiming to do, demystify it, because we're, even if you're in a digital team at an organization, we're not experts in AI, so we can't expect colleagues to be either. So I think doing that piece of work to slowly introduce them to what it is you're trying to achieve. I think also we start every project with lots of talking to people, so not just colleagues but also the users of these tools. You know, is this what you want? Would this be helpful? Would you be happy to engage in this way? I think that's really important too. And I think that, yeah, I think the more that you can speak to people and validate some of what it is you think would be a good thing to do, and test your assumptions, the better. Because I think that helps to bring anxiety levels down from, I don't know what this acronym is, to, oh, okay, fine, I get it. Well, here are some pragmatic steps forward. I think that's the advice that I would give. I mean, I think I've been at Brook a really long time, and there have been periods where the shutters have been quite down on lots of digital things. I mean, online appointment booking for a long time was a hard sell, and I think you just have to keep going and keep talking to people, and you know, don't slip into the acronyms. Try and keep things accessible, and again, make it about people. So this is to help you and to make your lives easier, but also it's going to help our users, and these are the appropriate ways that we can go about doing that for both of those groups.
So a sort of step-by-step approach if you've got colleagues who are perhaps a bit more nervous, especially around their safeguarding aspects. Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. It's fascinating. So Louise, let's come to you. I mean, obviously there's such a risk, isn't there? And you're setting the bar quite rightly very high in terms of the factual accuracy of the advice that you're giving to the people who come to you. Can you tell us a bit about how you're managing risk in these areas and some of those implications for safeguarding?
So we've certainly considered trying to choose use cases that sort of reduce that risk. So I mentioned that we wouldn't want to, currently ChatGPT gives very confident sounding answers, but not always what is called hallucinates, which is a bit anthropomorphizing, but it essentially makes stuff up. So we wouldn't want to ask people to use that to access any of we've got about 10,000 pages of information on our website, because it's very, very dense. But for us, we would still err on that side of we're saying until that technology improves, and there are actually other tools that are starting to come out, sort of enterprise versions of these, so where you'd be able to use the sort of the language processing abilities from one of these existing tools, but plug in your own website or your own knowledge base, and that it would provide answers from that source. And that those tools are starting to be created, and I think there will be more of those, and they will get cheaper over the next few years, at which point they might become more attractive to advice giving charities. But I think for the moment you can make a consideration of, is the potential risk of giving someone inaccurate advice worth the chance of going ahead with that? I think it's an interesting discussion actually for the charity sector, because if the choice is you make this information accessible to a new audience or a new group of people, is there a level of risk you would be happy to accept for that? I mean, humans also make errors, but somehow I think we're happy to accept that a human giving advice on a phone line will accept, a certain amount of inaccurate information. Apologies if you can hear the cat meowing in the background; she's very insistent. Whereas I think it is interesting that at the moment there's a very low tolerance of potential inaccuracy from some of our digital tools as well. And I think as a sector, we maybe want to consider what we're comfortable with. That would be a similar kind of question for some charities if they were looking to introduce like automated translations on their website, for example. Are you comfortable with the fact you'll get your information into the hands of some communities or some groups that you otherwise would never come to you if English is the only language you offer the information in, but you would have to accept that the quality of an automated translation is not as good as if you had an individual speaking to them like that. So I think there is an interesting space in charities for that. In terms of sort of minimizing risk in other cases, so yeah, you can choose use cases where humans have more input. And one of the things that we're looking at, I mentioned, is around our case write-up. So whenever any one of our 20,000 advisors gives information to the 1.5 million people who come to us by phone or face-to-face every year, all the stuff they talked about is captured on our system so that it's there if they come back to us and need to refer back to it. But a human can be speaking to an individual for an hour or more. So writing up all of those notes is a really time-intensive process. We're looking at some sort of automated summaries using telephone transcripts. If the transcript could reduce the amount of time it takes, even if it reduced every write-up by 5 minutes, that's several million sessions that we're conducting every year. So that would be a huge efficiency, which might mean that we're able then to meet other clients with that time saved. So but there'll be a sort of that balance of accuracy. We would probably still want to keep a human in that loop. We might not want to automate absolutely everything. We might want to still have humans checking the summaries. So I think, yeah, you can reduce your risk that way. If you're doing something like a chatbot or using any other digital tools, you'll also want to make considerations around privacy. So at Childline, when we were building the chatbot that lived on the website, we made sure that we were not using the natural language processing, so the tool that understands whether someone types in hi or hello or good morning, that those essentially all mean the same thing. We made sure to use a tool that was sort of locked down to our own environments and was not transmitting anything that a young person typed into that back to some faceless corporation somewhere for sort of data privacy. So I think there are other considerations like that we should also take into consideration.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity to consider, isn't there? And all these kind of touch points that our different users will have with what you do, and those safeguarding risk that can spring up all these different places. That's really interesting to hear how you're tackling all of that. Brilliant, thank you. So Penny, can we come to you now? Can we talk about, because you're obviously looking at this from a slightly different perspective from what MPC are doing, what are you exploring around safeguarding and AI?
We are really looking at so we're specifically looking at young people, and so we're looking at what their journey is from the entry point. And so especially with this generation of young people, they've lived a lot of their lives online. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand their entry point when they are in a place where they do need some support, and we're trying to develop that understanding so we can work out at what point would they then need a signposting service to refer them to a service that is within their local area. The difficulty with that is working out, because it's not just about signposting that young person, it's about whether or not that local provider, that local support service has the capacity to take on that young person. And so we are looking at it from lots of different points of view. And as I said, we are thinking about the infrastructure as a whole. So where does AI play a part in that? So as I said, we are working with the Mix, who are developing their chatbot. And in that development of the chatbot, at what point does a young person then need to speak to a person? Because it's great to create efficiency, but so that we are able to reach as many young people as we can. But at some point, that person may need to speak to a human being. And so where does that come in? So as I said, a lot of it is around the design of the infrastructure, the design of product. What does that look like? And safeguarding from that perspective, because at the end of the day, we need to bring the humanity into these tools that we're using, because we really want them to work for the benefit of people, not just for us to create a product because it's really nice and it's shiny and it's new, right? And so we really are thinking about the user journey not just the user journey, but the infrastructure. And as I said, with the development of Bard, ChatGPT, how does that change the way that we interact with search engines as well, which does impact signposting services? So we're working with multiple partners, not just the Mix, and they provide a service, they provide a signposting service, but with the introduction of AI into search engines, how does that impact how people find signposting services that will allow them to find the services that are around them? And so it's safeguarding, as I said, from a different perspective. I guess it's in a way more proactive than preventative, because we're thinking, where will different young people be, and how can we build that infrastructure so that they, when they are in need, they find what they're looking for. Yeah, and I would say that that's really how we've approached it, particularly with this Signpost Plus project.
So interesting, Penny, thinking ahead to those unintended consequences, and also what all of those different onwards journeys look like for young people. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. So it speaks to the complexity of all the things we need to consider in those different journeys across all those many areas of the sector's work. So in about 5 minutes time, we're going to start taking some questions, and I can already see them coming in the chat, which is great. So please do keep them coming. We're going to talk about one of my favourite topics now, which is leadership. So Laura, we spoke earlier, didn't we, about when you have to convince colleagues who may be a bit nervous about this stuff. If you're having to have a conversation maybe with your CEO or a trustee about safeguarding an AI, where do you begin?
I think events like this are a really good place. I think the more that we can talk to one another and share learning and share what's happening, share pitfalls, I think that's a brilliant place to start. And so whether that's leaders being involved in those directly, or as attending them, taking part in them, participating in them, and then sharing learnings back, I think that's always a really great place to begin, particularly because it's moving so quickly, and we'll keep having more and more that we need to respond to. I'd also say that again, I've mentioned it already, but talking to people is really important. So understanding what your users want and need from you. I think that when we have pushed the sort of the comfort levels of what we're doing digitally, it's been with the it's always been with the idea that what Brook particularly needs to do is it's our face-to-face time is really, really stretched. It's really precious, and the complexity of the problems that we see and the vulnerability of the people that we support is only getting greater. So digital for us has been a tool to protect that face-to-face time and move those people who are able to self-care and are not vulnerable in the same way to a digital means. So I think that it's worth leaders keeping in mind that often it can help you work smarter when at a time when funding cuts just keep coming and keep squeezing us. So I think that it's also about working smarter and asking those people you're supporting whether they're okay with what it is that you're proposing. And I think the other thing I would say is start small. So try one thing and then go from there, because you might try something that's about deploying AI to improve an internal process, so it feels relatively safe and relatively contained, and see how it goes. And if it goes well, move on from there. So I think those would be my tips. But I certainly think that sharing and talking and being open and saying, I'm not sure, Penny, can we have a call? Because you've done this great project. Can I get some insight from you? I think that's such a good way to start. I think you can only fail if you try and pretend that you know it all. I think it's the worst trap you can fall into.
Completely agree with that, Laura. I think the more we can all learn from each other across all the different charities about what we're doing and how we're doing it, the better. And that makes it all more reassuring, doesn't it? Because there's quite a lot of nervousness around this topic, understandably. Penny and Louise, would you like to come in on this? Have you had any interesting discussions with leaders about safeguarding an AI that you'd like to feedback about your learnings from those?
Yeah, I'd really echo Laura's suggestions about starting small. I would also encourage people to have a play around with this themselves. There's lots of tools that you can access for free, and I know there was lots of hype in our organisation when there was ChatGPT suddenly launched and people going, this will be the answer to everything that we've wanted. And I think it's really interesting that sometimes happens with technology tools in the way that I don't know, maybe wouldn't happen in some other spheres. So I don't know, you'd never go to a carpenter and say, I want you to make me a desk using this particular saw. You sort of go, I want you to make me a desk. Whereas I think there is sometimes with technology, there's yes, people can get distracted by the shiny newness of something. But I think, really reiterating points from Laura and Penny earlier, being really clear about what it is that you're trying to deliver as a service, and seeing this as potentially another tool to help you do that more effectively, or in a channel that your users are already accessing information and advice via, and making sure you stick to those.
So thanks, Louise, having that real clarity about what you're trying to do and why you're doing it. And so before we go to Q&A, Penny, have you got any advice for anyone who after this call might be having a bit of a challenging conversation with one of their leaders about safeguarding an AI?
I was just saying, well, firstly, I agree with Laura and Louise, and I would say approach everything with curiosity, because I think it's really important for us to ask questions about these tools. So and also to play around with ChatGPT, and not just ChatGPT, but there are lots of other products out there that are using AI. I noticed Grammarly the other day developed an AI type function where you can type something in and then ask it to rephrase, which I think is really great for people who may not necessarily be very confident in writing emails. I think that that's amazing. So there's lots out there, and I think we just need to approach everything with curiosity and kind of playing around with what works and what doesn't work, but also always asking questions. I think when it comes to speaking to leaders of an organization, it's much easier to approach things by asking the difficult questions that you are able to answer in those when you're having that conversation, which will give them the confidence that you've already thought about all of that you've kind of approached it with a pragmatic point of view. So I would say, curiosity, be pragmatic, ask the difficult questions and attempt to answer them yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really good. So really anticipating some of those questions and concerns that leaders might have about these different aspects of AI. Brilliant. Okay, so we're now going to go to some questions. We've got some great stuff that's come in on Q&A, so please do keep posting your questions and we will try and get through as many of them as we can. And I'm going to go through these in no particular order, if that's okay. So we've got a really interesting question here about accessibility. And Tilly's asked about disabilities, neurodiversity, the challenges that then come with that and accessing online information, and how people may be struggling to access these digital services already. So Laura, have you got any thoughts on how we can make these kinds of services accessible?
Yes, I was really pleased to see this question, Tilly, so thank you for asking it. This is something that we take really seriously. We actually have a designated neurodivergence lead at Brook, who is working across all of our areas of work to make sure that our services and our support are as accessible as possible. So looking at our website and developing easy read resources, developing a SEND curriculum for schools. There are touch points all across the organisation, and this would be a really key part of how we approach the development of anything AI powered, would be to work with our participation forum, which has a number of groups of people of different ages, and it would include working with people who are neurodivergent. So I think that's such a great question, and I think it's something that we can't afford to ignore. We've got to make sure that whatever we develop doesn't exclude people further. So yeah, great question. Thanks, Tilly.
Yeah, great question. And we haven't talked about inclusion that much today. So I think that's brilliant that that's coming up now. So thank you for prompting us on that, Tilly. Penny and Louise, have you got any thoughts on accessibility and indeed in inclusion in AI and as well? Because obviously both of those topics absolutely have implications for safeguarding as well, don't they?
Yeah, I can add something. I think you wouldn't just do this just because it happened to be an AI type project, but making sure that you're still co-designing with your potential users wherever you can, so that you really are baking in the way that someone will use the service or what they need from it from the start, making sure that you are testing it with them before you launch it. We found some quite interesting things when we launched the chatbot on Childline. We had programmed the content based on the most popular, most common topics that young people spoke to us about, either on the website or as web chat. And actually we found that on the chatbot, people were asking some different types of questions that potentially they maybe wouldn't have, wouldn't want to ask a human. So there were lots more questions in there, particularly around things like, how do I know if I'm gay? How can I come out to my friends? Things like that actually, those were much more prevalent in the questions asked to the bot than we got to humans. So I think taking that into consideration, actually maybe offering this sort of non-human service, at least in part, might be a new rule that, a new channel that some of your users might feel more comfortable with, but also then making sure that it is providing the advice or providing the service that those additional users will want and need.
Yeah, well, thank you, Louise. That's really, really thoughtful response. Penny, is there anything around accessibility and also inclusion as well that NPC is looking at with regards to safeguarding and AI?
Yeah, so similar to what Louise just said, we have developed a diverse group of young people who are all over the UK, and we've brought them together to support us to think about what that user journey will be. But in addition to that, I think because I agree with both Louise and Laura, I would say that the other thing to add to that would be that, as Laura explained at the beginning, the difference between AI and generative AI. And when it comes to generative AI, because it's collecting information that's already out there, just having that consideration in mind, that if a lot of that information isn't currently accessible to a lot of people, or it doesn't cover a diverse group of people in the way that the information has been set out, then the reality is, even with generative AI, you will find that there are some people who are not included in that. And I think that's just something that we just need to consider. I know that as time goes on and more people use it, it will develop further, but I think it's something that we do need to bear in mind. So we aren't approaching AI, especially generative AI, from the perspective of it will give us all of the answers. I think we do still need to be cognizant of the fact that there may be some people who aren't included in that, and how do we make an effort to include them? And I think that again comes back to how you design tools and products and things like that.
Yeah, I would Completely agree, Penny. And just to add, as an example, lots of the, I mean, same any technology tool, but lots of the generative AI tools really reflect a lot of the biases that already exist in society and exist in the information they were trained with. So, for example, you can go to image generators and ask them to show a CEO, and it will mostly generate a white man with glasses, and that's obviously is problematic for lots of reasons. So I think being aware that there are sort of the technology at the moment is not necessarily neutral in the way that it provides responses, and making sure that you're sort of educating yourself about potential bias in that.
Yeah, I think we've all seen those stories, haven't we, popping up on social media about how some of these tools can end up saying that only men are doctors and women are always nurses, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think you're both absolutely right about the testing and the diversity of the users who are involved, and that is great advice. Thank you. Lovely. So many good questions coming in. I want to start with this very meaty question from George, which is great. And I'm just going to read it out because there's a lot here. So George has asked, what are your thoughts about the pitfalls of AI and the availability of open source tools such as ChatGPT to the public? Thinking in the realms of safeguarding and criminality, especially exploitation, AI will inevitably be used to create false child sexual images, groom children, create convincing narratives. And George talks about the terrifying possibilities there as much as the amazing potential of some of these tools. And George has also said, positively, AI will help services pulling intelligence together to fight crime, think associates, highlight trends. And his question is, far from wanting to be negative, is anyone aware of any legislation coming forward in this space? So I'm going to throw that open to the three of you, and whoever knows about the topic of legislation in this area, please feel free to share what you know.
I can attempt a first stab at it. I do have to warn, I'm not an expert in this area. But yeah, the EU is just coming out with some legislation around the use of AI. I think that will be interesting. I think this whole sort of area of regulation is very interesting because up till now, laws have mostly applied within boundaries and within sort of geographic boundaries, and for technology tools that's becoming, of course, less relevant. So it's interesting that the EU is creating some tools and some rules rather, and that those would apply for any companies that were operating inside the EU. UK obviously may choose whether or not that we want to participate in those or create our own copies. And I know that Rishi Sunak has been trying to encourage businesses, AI businesses specifically, to do work in the UK, but has also said some murmurings about wanting to do that in a sort of responsible way. I think they have set up an office of AI, which I think should be the place that's sort of starting to build some legislation on this front. But as it stands, there's not really any firm rules that apply in this space, and it has slightly been left up to companies to sort of self-regulate, which doesn't necessarily work, as we all know. So I think you're right with some of the risks you highlight there. Those are absolutely some examples that we are already seeing. I think it is going to take lots of governments working together on this front. It can't just be a country trying to enforce some rules, because this data applies well beyond our own geographic boundaries.
Thank you, Louise. Laura, Penny, do you want to come in on that topic?
I don't know much about the legislation side of things, but I was going to pick up on one aspect of what George said and what Emily, who has also submitted a question, has said. They're sort of talking both about child sexual exploitation and AI being used in those crimes. Again, not an area of expertise for me or for Brook necessarily, but we have always worked quite closely with the National Crime Agency and CEOP, which is their sort of education arm. And I'm imagining that they will be all over this. And as you suggest, George, probably using AI themselves to target and to detect some of these crimes. So I'm going to pass the buck to someone who's not even here and say that NCA and CEOP are probably really well placed. And in fact, I'll reach out to them, and if I have any information, I'll include it in the email to you all next week, because it's a great point. And in fact, this morning, one of our sessions, as I mentioned, was all about child sexual exploitation and child criminal exploitation. And I'm certain that is already coming up as a part of that.
Thanks, Laura. That's really helpful. Right, so we're getting close to the point where we will be wrapping up the session at 15:15. I've got a great question here, though, which I think is perfect for you, Penny, if you'd like to come in on it. And so it's about young people, and this delegate has asked, how do we stop AI chatbots in place of people from making those vulnerable young people feel more lonely rather than supported? So taking into consideration that this communication will be between them and AI, and that really chimes with what you were saying earlier about some of those different user journeys and different agencies that will be involved. What are your thoughts on AI and loneliness?
With the work that we have done with the mix, it was interesting that they shared with us that there are times where they found that young people don't seem to really mind that they are, whether they're speaking to a chatbot or talking to a person, which was really interesting in that they were still able to share their experience regardless of who they were speaking to. I think that this is an area that we still need to explore a bit more. I think it may, again, going back to the user journey, it may be a point for that young person where they may be experiencing loneliness. I think the issue with using a chatbot would be where that person isn't able to speak to a person at a point where they really needed to. And so I really do think it goes back to, how does the chatbot interact with that person? Again, I guess I can't necessarily speak for all young people and for all young people who are using a chatbot, but what we've heard so far is that it doesn't, I guess in answer to that question, what we found so far is that the young person accessing the chatbot doesn't necessarily create that space of loneliness. I think it might be something that happens before then. So that's the part that I think that we really probably need to pay a bit more attention to. And then also what happens after that young person is no longer speaking to the chatbot, and what happens after that initial communication with the chatbot, again, as I said, where they need to speak to a person. But again, I feel like we are all in a territory where we are learning and exploring, and so that may change. I agree with that point about loneliness, and that, you know, for a lot of people, they are feeling a lot more. For a lot of people, loneliness is a factor in their lives, and so I think we just need to consider what that looks like and at what point are they more vulnerable. But yeah, as I said, it hasn't seemed to be an issue with the chatbot from what we have seen so far, but definitely definitely a question to keep in mind for sure.
Some really big challenging issues there, which obviously the sector's doing some work in anyway, and thinking about how AI can kind of highlight and also tackle those issues is definitely something to think through as part of this. So brilliant. Thank you, Penny. Really, really helpful. So I'm going to hand back to Laura in a moment, but before we do that, I just want to say thank you so much to our amazing panelists today, Laura, Penny and Louise. I've learned so much from speaking to all of you, and I know that our delegates will have as well. And thank you so much for covering a lot of ground. We've covered everything from legislation to, you know, the different ways that the sector services are interacting with those of other agencies, right through to all these complexities of safeguarding and managing risk, and also how you have that difficult conversation with colleagues at the same level as you or at leadership level who may also be struggling to get their heads around this stuff, as we all are. So thank you so much to our panel today. Thank you for Brooke for hosting this, and Laura, I'll hand to you to close the session today.
Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, I think we covered a huge amount there, didn't we? There was all sorts that came into that conversation, and I hope that for those of you who have attended who are a bit more advanced in your AI journey, that today provided some interesting pause for thought. And for those of you who are early in your journey or haven't even embarked on it yet, that you've managed to get something useful from this. As I said, I'll be sending around an email probably next week in follow-up from this session with links to the things that we've talked about. I might try and think of how we might be able to share some of those definitions if they're helpful. I'm also going to be sharing a video of JJ Gatt, the founder of EBO, who sponsored today's session. JJ has some really interesting insights to share around how we need to use our charitable values, but also the things that make us human, like empathy, like creativity, to guide our use of AI. And just to echo and to sort of build on what you said, Zoe, thanks so much, Penny and Louise, for joining us today. Your contributions were so valuable, and it was so interesting to hear about what you're working on and your perspectives on AI. Zoe, thanks so much to you as well for leading us through that discussion. And thanks to everyone who joined. We really appreciate it. And we hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I think we have.